99.5 FM, and WBAI.org online. Stay tuned.
Don't give up, don't give in. Don't you let the man win. Stand up, be proud. Say it with the end. Say it loud. We will not be island anymore. We will not be island anymore.
Say hello, I'm John Kane, and this is Resistance Radio. I want to thank you for joining me. It is great to be on the air in New York City on WBAI. We also do a show, the same show, usually rebroadcast on WPFW in Washington, D.C., but we will be doing a live show down there tomorrow. So this one's just for you, New York. So so I want to address you, just you. Well, and of course, anybody else who's listening online, whether you're listening to the show as a podcast or post it up as a video for both Facebook and for YouTube. I don't do it live anymore on video because, frankly, Facebook has been kind of jerking me around a little bit. So I record the video and then I post it up after the fact. So unfortunately, you got to be a little bit patient if you want to. If you feel the need, you got to see me to listen to me. Then that's what you got to go through. But again, I appreciate being on the air in New York City. But I'll tell you, can't do it without you. You're hearing an awful lot about not just funding being cut, but I mean everything from Stephen Colbert being canceled by CBS. The amount of pressure that the Trump administration has been putting on universities to tailor what kind of speech will happen at those schools. All of that stuff is really impacting what we do. Those of us who advocate for social justice and who fight oppression every single day, look, it doesn't change what I do, but it is changing who's prepared to embrace the message. WBAI is not a risk. As far as I know, they're not going to cancel me because I happen to rub Donald Trump the wrong way. I'm not too worried about that. But what we do rely on is you, the listener, to support this radio station. So I got to tell you, we can't do it without you. We don't get the Corporation for Public Broadcast funds anyway, or haven't in many years, but that's gone. I mean, that's gutted by the Trump administration. We rely on you. So I'm asking that you donate to WBAI. In a perfect world, you become a buddy of this program, of this station, and you would do so by going online or placing a call. You can go online and you can go to buddy.wbai. That's buddy.wbai.org. Follow the prompts. Make sure you put Resistance Radio as the show that you are enlisting on behalf of. I would greatly appreciate that. But you know what? If you can't do a monthly, $5 or $10 or $15 or $20 a month, so we can see that money continuously throughout the year. If you can only do a one-time donation, then do a one-time donation. You can still do that on that same website. So that's what I'm asking you to do. I'm asking you to support this radio station. I'm asking you to support this program. Look, voices like mine are a rarity, and without stations like this, you simply just won't have them. So again, you can go online to buddy.wbai.org, or you can call 1-833-922-4692. Use your credit card. You can use your bank account, ACH, whatever you've got to do. If you call the number and you get an answering machine or a voice message, just leave your name and your number, and they'll call you right back. Sometimes we get multiple calls at the same time, and we only have so many lines. So please do make a donation to WBAI, and do it. I hope you'll do it in the name of Resistance Radio. it all goes to the same place. It goes to support the station. But it does send a little bit of a message. I remember one time under the previous administration, I was told I haven't raised a dime in a very long time. Look, am I a great funder of? Do I bring a lot of revenue into WBI? I don't know. I used to do okay. I used to do on the buddy program. I used to have more buddies enlisted under my show than any other 1 hour week, per week show. But I don't know what happened there. But so I'm asking you to again support the radio station, support this program, so you can still continue to hear stuff you're not going to hear anywhere else. And I'm going to tell you some stuff today that I know you haven't heard of elsewhere, and it's not something that I'm entirely pleased to talk about. But I got to talk about the failure of Native leadership. I did a post on Facebook this week, and I'm at the point now that I'm almost completely done with the federally recognized leadership of Native communities, U.S. or Canadian side. It's all the same thing. The amount of corruption and the amount of selling out of our people that I see every day over the years. And look, if we go back in time, Dick Wilson with the Guardians of the Oglala Nation, the Goon Squad that he had, the whole standoff in Pine Ridge, and it was all over this. It was all over this. It was over a corrupt Native government. And so how do these things come to exist? Well, I'll tell you, the federal government creates them. They literally have passed a law back in 1934 called the Indian Reorganization Act, and it was. They claim that it had all of these altruistic reasons for doing so, but at the end of the day, they were trying to get rid of traditional government. So they were trying to get every Native territory to accept help in crafting or craft a U.S.-like constitution, so they would operate almost like within the system of federalism. And if you don't know what that means you have the federal government, you have state government, you have county government, you have town government. Somewhere in that system of hierarchy and that waterfall of jurisdictional coverage, the federal government wanted Native people to fit in there somewhere. So we were going to be a part of that system, almost municipalizing us back in 1934. That didn't go over well, but it did change. Many traditional governments, because they found themselves a little bit on the chopping block. If they didn't do this, if they didn't show some process that the federal government would accept for who their leadership was, primarily so they could wheel and deal with them on everything from land claims to mineral extraction to any number of things. And so all of these tribal councils and on Canadian side band councils all got created almost as an extension of the U.S. and the federal government. And every one of these fully accepts this notion of the so-called trust responsibility. That's part of the reason I have a problem with them. They all accept this notion that they sit only as merely wards of the federal government, that the federal government is their trustee, that they have ultimate authority to limit the metes and bounds of their so-called sovereignty. Now, the people don't necessarily accept that. But all of these tribal councils, and look, and even the few traditional councils that avoided that, and some of the ones who rejected the IRA, the Indian Reorganization Act, but still changed their government. Seneca Nation, they threw out the so-called chief system, which it shouldn't have ever been a chief system, should have been a clan system, in 1848. So they already created, with the help of Quakers and white people advising them how to construct their 4-page constitution, which is the government that Seneca Nation operates under now, with some variation. So they threw the baby out with the bathwater, even before 1934, but they never really accepted the Indian Reorganization Act because that had other things associated with it. One of the things that the Indian Reorganization Act did, it also redefined what a Native person or what a Native tribe was, what a federally recognized tribe was. As of 1934, all of the nations that had predated the United States, if they were federally recognized, they were recognized as a tribe, band, or nation of Indians subordinate to the laws of the United States. band councils, even the ones who were not necessarily IRA, all accepted that. The people didn't. In fact, for the most part, the people weren't even aware of some of this stuff. So I realized that, okay, 1934, that's still a long time ago. Certainly things have progressed since then. Not really. You know, we've not only have we seen the likes of Dick Wilson or Ray Halbritter out in Oneida, or some of these really, really corrupt officials who have done nothing but line their pockets, but traditionally, in the era of the Indian Reorganization Act, and I say traditionally, it's kind of a bad word to use, I guess. The haves and the have-nots on every native territory were always divided along the same line. Those that worked for the tribe and those who didn't. All those who were either in government or worked for the tribal government were the ones with the housing, the ones with the jobs, the ones with all these benefits. And the ones who were more destitute and struggling were the ones who either wouldn't fully embrace. I mean, this is one of the reasons, I gotta tell you, I don't like to use the word citizenship when I describe us. I don't consider myself a citizen of the Mohawk Nation, because that implication, if you look up the word citizen, what it says is that you have, that you have an allegiance or towards a specific government. When I say the Mohawk Nation, I don't mean the institution. I mean the people. I mean the place. So even as I sit here in Seneca territory, which is where I do my show from, even as I sit here in Seneca territory, I fully support the Seneca Nation as a blanket description of the people. I support the Seneca people, but I don't support the Seneca Nation as an institution. The system of government is terrible. They have a council. I think that it's 16 counselors, 8 from the Allegheny territory and 8 from the Cattaraugus territory, and that gets a little fuzzy sometimes because of where somebody is considered from, I guess, because they're Seneca Nation either way, right? They can buy votes. They can pay people to vote. They the counselors serve, I think, for 4 years, but the president and the treasurer and the clerk, those 3 executive positions, they only serve for 2 years, and then they alternate. So 2 years they have to come from one of the territories, and then the next 2 years has to come from another territory. So it's hard to build continuity, but it also, you also see how it gets manipulated because of having to select essentially a chief operating officer and chief financial officer from one specific territory, not necessarily the best candidate, but from you're being dictated to. So it's kind of a bit of a twisted system. And of course, I'm not a big fan of voting and what has been defined as democracy, because here's the problem with democracy, as it is understood. It's not just majority rule. It's almost like mob rule. You never get the majority of the full majority of the population in any place, not the United States, not a state election, certainly not native elections. You get a relatively small amount of people who actually participate in the system, and then it's only the majority of that participating group. And I know most people are saying, well, if you don't participate, you don't have a voice. Well, the problem is if you have 51% that go one way and you have 49% go the other, you got almost half the population dissatisfied with the choice. And, of course, we see that in federal government, you see that in state government, and you see that in native government. So as Haudenosaunee, we based our system on reaching consensus. I'm not saying our system was flawless, but it wasn't so rigid and institutionalized that somebody's got to say, well, if we look at wampum number 47 on the of the Gayenaragoa, it says no. We don't do that. I mean, there are people who tried to do that, but that's not the way we articulate inconsistencies in traditional government. But again, many traditional governments were phased out because of the Indian Reorganization Act. Canada essentially has really done away with it, but in the United States, most of it's been done away with as well. So what's the result of it? Well, the result is you have these band counselors or tribal counselors who are oftentimes more they gain their power from the recognition they get from the federal government, Canadian or U.S. In fact, they'll tout themselves as the federally recognized leader. That's what you'll hear Ray Halberter call himself, right? Even in Onondaga, where we're the federally recognized leadership. So, and this is what you see throughout Indian country. And so these federally recognized leaders, they have the ultimate power. There's almost no circumstance where the federal government says, well, we want to make sure that you are serving your people correctly. No, just give us somebody who can sign papers. It's always been the way. Every time we've had a conflict with the state over taxes or something like that, they always said, give us somebody who can sign an agreement. We would never give them that. That's why we still exist today, developing commerce based on the state not having any say on what we do here. But that isn't because the governments, the tribal governments, the Seneca Nation or the Mohawk Nation or anybody else, that's not because they wheeled and dealed. We actually developed parallel institutions for that. We called it the League of First Nations at one point. And we carried the ball forward on things like the taxation over tobacco and fuel. We wouldn't even let the tribal councils do it. But they are the ones who get drawn to the table, and all I can think about is Akwesasne and this terrible land claim deal that the band council from the Canadian side, the Mohawk Council of Akwesasne, and that's an elected council, basically empowered by Canada. The St. Regis Tribal Council, Mohawk Tribal Council, which is the U.S. band council or tribal council, federally recognized, of course. And then they actually used one of the longhouses, not all the longhouses, but they only used specific individuals who sat in positions that were titled from the longhouse. And they wheeled the deal and made a terrible land claim deal. They gave up, what they gave up is almost irreparable. I mean, and they're going to get paid a little bit of money. And they're going to get some land back. And some of that land's going to be held in trust by the federal government. It's not going to be truly their title. That's not what they even fought for, which is how most of our lands confined by the borders of New York State. I live here on the Seneca Nation territory of Cattaraugus. The Seneca Nation, the Seneca people own this land. I mean, the tribal council, the Seneca Nation their government couldn't undo that. It is so entrenched that this is Seneca land. It's not held in trust by the federal government. It's not Indian country by their definition, none of that stuff. So when I see bad land claims, and I've seen every one of these things go badly. I saw Oneida, sell out for their casino. Everything they did was about commercial property. It wasn't about necessarily expanding a national land base. In fact, Oneida used to was almost reduced down to 32 acres. And then they bought properties here and they bought properties there and they put casinos or smoke shops in there. The nation did. Individuals can't do anything in Oneida. There's no private sector economy at all in the Oneida Nation. It's all run by one guy, the federally recognized leader. So beyond the land claims issues, which are absolutely horrendous, you also get into things like mineral extraction. Look, I listened to even the president of the NCAI when Brian Clattersby was in there, and he would say that the energy resources on native territories represented 10% of the U.S. energy resources. And I'm thinking, does it? Why wouldn't it represent 100% of ours? Why are you essentially attributing native resources as a percentage of U.S. resources? I mean, I don't even think he got the language problem. But you see, all of this stuff is done this way. Part of the whole thing, and I talk about this in our film, The Long Hope, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in the second part of the show. The United States treats us like we're theirs. The reason the United States wouldn't vote for the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which isn't a perfect document, by the way. I don't want to suggest for a second, even the wording of it, there's a lot that I don't like about the UNDRIP, as it's called. But the U.S. wouldn't vote for it nor would Canada, nor would Australia, nor would New Zealand. And the reason they wouldn't vote for it, or at least from a United States standpoint, and I know this because they actually said the words, they didn't like the idea of utilizing the international definition of self-determination for Native peoples. Let me say it again. They wanted to redefine what self-determination meant for Native people and separate it from what is regarded as the international definition of self-determination. I mean, the self-determination from an international standpoint is tantamount to statehood, if that's what people want, to asserting all of the attributes of sovereignty. But the United States didn't want that. In fact, they rejected the idea that Native people could assert sovereignty over their own lands and their own resources. How do I know this? They put it out in a document. I think it was, like the, National Security Agency or something. They put a document out saying it. I mean, they flat out said they rejected the notion that a federally recognized tribe, could assert their sovereignty over their land and their resources. That's why they rejected the international definition of self-determination and only wanted to recreate a domestic definition of self-determination. My friend Jack Hustine did a great cartoon, and it's in our film, by the way, where it's got this Native guy sitting on the ground like a dog with a chain to a post, and two white guys, one of them looking like looking all of like Uncle Sam, saying, "Yeah, we just give him a measly meal, one measly meal a day, and basically he's content." Because that is what they view self-determination. Yeah, we might have to add a link or two to the chain, but make no mistake about it, they're going to put a chain on us. And part of the whole reason we did the film that we did, I want people to understand that even in the midst of the so-called progress that the United States claims they've made with racism and injustice and bigotry, civil rights, and all that other stuff. I mean, abolishing slavery, granting citizenship to the formerly enslaved, and doing all this stuff. Not much has changed for Native people. Oh yeah, they tried to declare we were U.S. citizens in 1924, but that wasn't an offer. That wasn't a grant. We were already peoples. We were already independent, free and independent peoples. But you try to pass laws saying, "Oh no, we don't recognize you as independent peoples anymore." They did that in like 1871. They tried over and over again to corral us in to this notion that we were wards of the federal government, that we were theirs, that our land was theirs. See, and this is where it's a bit of a problem for the federal government when it comes to our lands here. And that's why they try to manipulate land claims the way they do. The land here, again, in Seneca territory, is owned by the Seneca people. It is called restricted fee title. It's not trust land. It's not held. There's no New York State or federal deed for the property here. There's only Seneca title. The restricted fee part of it comes because the federal government claims that they have the first right of refusal, that only the federal government could acquire land from the Seneca people, from the lands that we hold here in quote unquote New York State. And that it would have to be, abide by the the Interstate Commerce Clause of the federal government. But that there was nobody else. We couldn't sell the land to individuals. It would have to, the title would have to go to the federal government first, and then to the states, and then to individuals. And it certainly couldn't go to a foreign government. So the restriction on our fee title is that we don't have choices if we ever wanted to sell our land. Of course, we don't want to anyway, so we don't really worry too much about that notion. But it's different everywhere else. Almost all of Canada is land held in trust. It's held by the Crown. Almost all of the land, native land across the U.S. continent, or the United States, is held in trust by the federal government. I mean, and it's crazy because some of that land title is pretty obscure. My friend Peter Dorico just published a story about an individual who was grazing his cattle, native guy, grazing his cattle on land that essentially should have been in dispute. I mean, it was native lands, but the federal government said, no, those are federal lands. They wanted to charge him like millions of dollars for illegal grazing. They started taking it out of his Social Security when he was retired. He tried to fight it. And here's the crazy part. Here's how he tried to fight it. And I'm not crazy about the way he tried to fight it, but here's how he tried to fight it. He said, I'm a ward of the federal government. The U.S. attorney can't bring this kind of action against me. They're supposed to defend me. That's their job. They are our trustees. And of course, that argument fails. I mean, it was because at the end of the day, it's like Sam Alito says when talking about the trust responsibility. He says, look, it's not really a trust. You know, the trust relationship between the United States and Native peoples doesn't have the same fiduciary responsibilities or duties that a real trust, a trust in common law has. There's no primary beneficiary because at the end of the day, the federal government says we're always going to treat this trust relationship in such a manner that our interest comes first. And our interest may also be protecting the state's interest. So where do the native interests come as the so-called wards or beneficiaries of this trust relationship? Down the road. Because they can grant mining companies, oil companies, they can do whatever they want. In fact, one of the arguments, and this is where this thing got kind of crazy at one point, in the Hickory Apache case, where they were asking, they wanted the information associated with the negotiation between the federal government as their trustee and a mining company who was going to come in and do a mining contract. It's their lands. I mean, it's their resources. And the federal government ruled against them. They said, no, you're not entitled to that information. They said, well, wait a minute. You can't deny us information when you were negotiating on our behalf. Yeah, but again, it's not really it's not the same as a real trust. We can claim that there was lawyer-client confidentiality, privilege associated with the United States negotiating those mining contracts, and you're not entitled to that information, but you're negotiating them on our behalf. It's, well, not entirely, and so this is where the whole thing unravels. But again, let me get back to where my original comments are. Tribal governments, federally recognized governments, they're almost bound to accept this trust responsibility, this ward status, this plenary powers doctrine. And we see how it goes. Look, I spend a pretty good amount of time on our film, The Long Hope, talking about how the Senecas got screwed in their gaming compact that they had operated for 21 years with the state of New York. The state of New York would have taken over half the revenue of that gaming operation, except for the Senecas withheld payment at one point and reached a settlement where they kept $200 million. But that was the difference. $2.4 billion came to the Seneca Nation in 21 years of operation. $2.2 billion went to the state. No investment, no operational responsibilities, nothing to do but sit back and collect money for a fictitious exclusivity that never really existed. And I say it's fictitious because the state of New York was taking market share through gaming parlors the entire time, and then changed their constitution so they could get in the casino business. So there was no exclusivity. The vast majority of Seneca people oppose this notion of revenue sharing. It's not required by law. In fact, it's supposed to be regulated. The Interior Department says revenue sharing can only exist if the state offers a valuable concession, one that is substantial and quantifiable. It means that you should be able to put a value on it. And the revenue sharing has to be somewhere underneath that value, because otherwise, why do it? If it's only a break even, then if it's not benefiting you, then it doesn't make any sense to do it. So it had to be substantial and quantifiable according to the Interior Department. Of course, they don't enforce anything. That gaming compact expired a couple of years ago. The current president of the Seneca Nation ran on a platform of no revenue sharing. Guess what? They're going for revenue sharing. They've come up with this idea that they could pay the state for permission, which is not what gaming, that's not what IGRA, the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, is all about. It's not about paying the state for permission, but they're under the impression that if they pay the state for permission to do internet gaming, so perhaps the Seneca Nation could have an app on your phone where you can play a slot machine on your phone. If they pay the state a percentage of revenue sharing, they're not even telling the people a percentage of what revenue, though. Are you still talking about our physical slot machines? Or are you only talking about paying a revenue sharing based on whatever internet gaming might become? Look, I know it exists right now in some places, but it's still a bit of an unknown. And then there's talk about geofencing. Oh, yes, there would be an exclusivity zone. Again, like they haven't gone down that route before. So this current administration will not release a draft compact to their people. They've had a series of these public meetings. And I'm so disgusted with it because the people have asked questions and they can't get a reasonable answer. So for me, the final straw, and you look, land claims, mineral extraction, some of these, all the corruption over the years, it should have been enough for me. But I was still holding out hope that the Seneca Nation would set a standard, at least in gaming. But they're going to give up their revenue again. They're going to pay the state of New York. And here's the problem with paying the state of New York. If you end up with a dispute, let me remind people what Kathy Hochul did to the Seneca Nation. When the Seneca Nation said, well, hey, we never agreed to pay you that last 7 years, so we're not. Well, they took them to binding arbitration, got two white guys versus the one native judge in that tribunal to say, yeah, you got to pay them. Yeah, we think there's enough information in the compact that implies, of course, there's no such thing as implied regulations in a contract, but we think you have to pay. So we're saying you have to pay 25% of your gross gaming revenue, which is about 50% of the net revenue, because all the expenses came out of the Seneca Nation's cut. So the Seneca Nation disputed that, and they said, look, we want the Interior Department to weigh in on this. Deb Haaland, Native Interior Secretary, she wouldn't touch it. She avoided it completely. So what does Kathy Hochul do? She froze every Seneca Nation government account. All of them, froze them all, and said, unless you pay us $560 million, we're gonna keep your accounts frozen. Seneca Nation started bouncing checks. They'd already written checks to vendors and employees and other bills they had to pay. She does this on a Friday. By Monday, the Seneca Nation caved and said, all right, we'll cut the check. They cut him a check, release $560 million. Kathy Hochul then turns around and gives over $400 million of it to the billionaire owner of the Bills as part of the state's contribution to help build a new stadium to keep the Buffalo Bills here in Western New York. You can't make this stuff up. So after that lesson learned about how ruthless the state can be if they perceive or can somehow get a white judge or a couple of white judges to agree that you owe them money, this is the power that they have. This is what we call asymmetry. When the state has all this power because they have the federal government giving them all the power, and then there's us down here. There's no level playing field. There's no level playing field. And look, and things aren't any better with this current administration, but they sucked under the Biden administration. Look, some of this dispute goes back to Clinton. I mean, this has been going on for a long time. So make no mistake about it. The federal government has treated Native people as incompetents. The whole Indian Gaming Regulatory Act was about saying you cannot run your own gaming unless you have the state in your business. We're making it federal law. We need to appoint guardianship over your gaming operation, and we're making the governor that guardian. That's what the federal government did when they passed the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. So make no mistake about it. We don't need the state. And we don't need permission from the state. But under the federal law, we have to enter into a gaming compact, a contract about the regulatory systems that we employ. Now, we could have played hardball and said, look, we'll do some information sharing. We'll let you know. We'll be transparent about what our gaming is. But we're not going to let you run our gaming operations or tell us what we can and can't do. They don't really run. There's no day-to-day operations being performed by the state. But if the Seneca Nation wanted to create side betting on some of the table games, during the Andrew Cuomo administration, he had to approve that, or they couldn't even do it. So again, this notion of internet gaming, if our sovereignty is intact, and clearly the federal government recognized that we have the right to do gaming, then why do we need the state? Why do we need permission from the state to do internet gaming? If that's a thing. And if it's already being done by states, whether it's New York State's doing it or not, if it's already being done, why do we need the state's permission? See, nobody's even asking that question. That's the problem. Therein lies the problem. This is where leadership, federally recognized tribal leadership, sells their people out. And they do it over and over and over again. Look, the mascot fight, there was no nation standing beside me when I took this to the state. When I took it to the Department of Education, it was just me. I used statements of theirs over the years. But for all the bluster the United Nations was making over the Redskins, they weren't there. Nobody was there. And in fact, what did the Seneca Nation do? They let the Salamanca School District keep their native mascot because some Senecas go to school there. So they kind of undermined. Look, I was all for giving final say to certain nations about the mascot issue. But I supported that idea because I didn't think that they'd go for it. Although, I got to tell you, I quietly thought the Seneca Nation would do this. But the president of the Seneca Nation, not the council, but the president of the Seneca Nation granted the Salamanca City School District permission to call themselves Warriors, even though the majority of kids are not native. But this is what I'm talking about. This is how much our issues are sold out by the quote-unquote federally recognized leadership. And it happens over and over again. It pains me to say this, that there are no federally recognized tribal governments that I'm aware of that fully do right by their people. I support the Puspatuk, Harry Wallace, the Unkachug. I mean, Harry's one of the few guys that I have respect for who sits in a leadership position. But they're still battling over whether the federal government will recognize them or not. The Shinnecock, which have kind of gone through this process, look, they're compromised because they want land put into trust. Something the rest of us in the state of New York, and I say within the confines of the state of New York, we don't necessarily support. Well, except for Akwesasne, I guess they sold out. But they want land put into trust. So they're afraid to cross Trump. So on a lot of these issues, even the mascot issue, Shinnecock's been quiet. They've been quiet. Look, and my buddy Lance Gums, who's been on the show, they've had their own fights with New York State over things like their sign, their monument. Lance works with NCAI. NCAI isn't exactly on the cutting edge of fighting for sovereignty. They advocate some native issues, and some they do better than others. But for the most part, they're never going to embrace this notion of a free and independent native peoples. No, they still embrace this notion of being tribal governments under the the Indian reorganization definition of that. Look, there's almost 600, 570 or so federally recognized tribes. Not all of them have conceded to being a tribe, band, or nation of Indians subordinate to the laws of the United States. But on top of that number, there's probably another 500 or more native peoples who are not federally recognized. I know some of them are, there's some dispute on the legitimacy. I've talked about the Lumbees, for instance, which are not really an original nation. They are primarily the descendants of Creek and Tuscarora and other peoples of that area. They got called Lumbees because there was a group of them living along the Lumberton River. White folks called them Lumbees. It was almost a derogatory slang to refer to the native people who lived along the Lumberton River. And the Lumberton River was called that because they used it for floating logs down. It wasn't even, that's not our word. So neither Lumbee or where it's derived from has anything to do with being with native terminology. Nothing. There's no Lumbee language. There's no Lumbee culture. It's all culture that came from the other nations that they are derived from. So we end up with this question mark. And of course, Trump loves the Lumbees because apparently they supported him in the last election or something like that. I don't know. So my frustration comes because all of this corruption, all of this wielding of power over people comes from the federal government. I mean, there have been leadership disputes across the country. And, look, I even got to mention, look, the Standing Rock dispute over the Dakota Access Pipeline. Dave Archambault, he was all about pandering to Barack Obama. But you know what? That pipeline is there. It got completed. It got run through. It didn't matter that Barack Obama seemed to be a nicer president to Native people. He wasn't. He sold us out too. So, look, I'm about to release, and I say this because I'm not exactly sure what that means, but we're about to release our film, The Long Hope. I know some of you have seen some of the trailers that I put out. I do plan to come to New York. I'm talking with the folks at Maisels in Harlem. My friend Melissa Oakes is setting up a film festival that will run for months. We're going to do a couple of screenings of it in that. I will take it out to Huntington, where I always do film screenings, and I'll do a screening there. But I'm hoping to do a couple in Manhattan, perhaps one or two in Brooklyn. Out in Long Island, I'm hoping that I can get one of the universities, perhaps Hofstra, to do a screening. And then I want to go to DC. I want to go to some other places. But more importantly, I want to go to Native territories. So I'm in the process of gathering that information to do some of these screenings. And I got to tell you, this film will change what you think you know. A lot of it's the stuff that I talk about in this program. But the idea of seeing, it's not quite 2 hours, but it's almost 2 hours. It's not a film strip from school. No, this is 1 hour and 54 minutes long, and it is packed. In fact, we recorded so much footage that some of the threads we really couldn't pull on in the film, we're going to do other segments. In fact, I just released one on the mascot issue. That's part of our Long Hope project, which is what the film is called, The Long Hope. But if you've seen it, I posted it up on, I think on YouTube, and I posted up on Facebook, the mascot segment that was just pulled from the footage for this film. I do mention the mascot issue, or it is mentioned in the film. I think when people watch this film, look, my friend Peter DeRico, he called it a masterpiece. And look, I'm sure he's somewhat biased because much of the work that went into this film came from him. I mean, Stephen Newcomb and Peter DeRico are two of the guys whose shoulders I stand on every single day. Stephen Newcomb taught us about the doctrine of Christian discovery. He taught us about the trilogy of cases from the Marshall administration, or the Marshall court, who the longest serving Supreme Court justice in history of the United States. He taught us about those. Peter DeRico pulled those threads a little farther, talked about the controversies, the fact that there's hypocrisy and there's no continuity between this notion of creating these legal doctrines that defy everything that the United States claims it represents. All of their justice and, equality, all of that stuff that they embrace as their creeds are not a part of how Native people have been treated. Look, they took our kids for 150 years. They took our children and they indoctrinated them in prison-like schools where they were abused, they were raped, they were murdered, they were allowed to die. That's what the United States did. While they're doing everything else, expanding their economies and stealing more land, and even conceding certain things, ending slavery, granting citizenship to the formerly enslaved, passing the Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act was passed. Brown versus the Board of Education. These things happened while Native people were still, and we are still to this day, regarded as wards of the federal government. Who and what world can a people who pre-exist your existence, pre-exist the United States as a whole, live thriving lives for thousands and thousands of years, how do we become wards of the federal government? Well, I'll tell you, if there is any level of incompetence that we somehow can't take care of ourselves, it's because you did that. You stole our land. You claimed our land. You herded us onto unsustainable territories that you called reservations. You created the abject poverty. You stole our children, changing their minds for 150 years. So yeah, do we struggle? But I'll tell you, we aren't wards of your government. You owe us. You owe us a debt that you agreed upon. Look, when you were taking lands, these didn't come for free. Yes, they were fraudulently taken, but there was an obligation that you took on. Healthcare, education. No, not indoctrination, education. There were certain things that you promised. As you made it impossible for us to feed ourselves, you sent food, oftentimes rancid food. The debt that you owe us is not charity. I hate the idea that for me to go to the Seneca Nation Clinic and receive health care, of course I'm over 65, so I can use my Medicare. They want us to be insured. They want us to pay for our insurance or be a part of the social service programs to have health care administered. That's a debt the federal government owes, not the states. And we certainly, look, I know it sounds terrible to say that we deserve free health care. Everybody deserves free health care, frankly. But you made that commitment and then completely rejected your obligation and your responsibility. So, no, we aren't incompetent. We are not too ignorant to run our own businesses and to run our own communities. We aren't. You claimed we are. You've treated us as if we are. That is the problem. That's what my film exposes. So, as I start to make announcements to do these screenings in New York and in Washington and other places, I hope you'll come out. I hope you'll come out and learn some truth. And, at some point, perhaps we are able to get this up on a streaming service so more and more eyes can see it. But I got to tell you, Seneca Nation didn't fund this thing. This was funded by individuals. One of the guys who supports me to do the work that I do. I did all the writing for the film. And It is the most complete acknowledgement of everything that Dorico and Newcomb have taught us over the years. But we take it and we apply it to what the Senecas and Mohawks and other people have gone through. Our fights against New York State. It is a complete acknowledgement that they have manipulated our lives in a way that nobody else has been manipulated. Like I said, 150 years of residential schools, the rape and the murders, the neglect. Sometimes the mortality rate was over 50% from these schools. Today, we see news report after news report on the Canadian side of the unmarked graves that are being discovered through ground penetrating radar. Over 10,000 potential grave sites. Over 10,000. And that's only been less than a dozen sites that have been investigated. The U.S. hasn't even begun. Oh, yeah, we get Joe Biden apologizing. We get Kathy Hochul apologizing. But they won't even own up to what really happened. How much death? How much loss? Deb Haaland, and I'm going to say it again, I've said it before. She decided that the starting place for how much the federal government should pay to right this wrong should be how much they paid to commit the wrong. In what world do you look at a crime committed, especially a crime of genocide, and say, well, yeah, but how much did you pay to commit genocide? We're gonna use that as the basis. We're gonna do an equivalent of what it cost us to commit genocide. Do you ask a bank robber how much it cost for them to commit the crime? Or do you look at what they took? Or do you look at the damage they've done? If a chemical company puts something out there that harms people, you don't ask them, well, how much did it cost you to develop that chemical? How much did it cost you to develop that drug? No, you assess how many people were affected by it and impacted by it. You do a damage assessment. That's not what's being done with the residential schools. United States, and they won't. We will start to assess some of those damages. Maybe some tribes will be involved, but it's probably going to be more independent groups of people doing it. This is the problem that I have. So I want you, the listener of this show, and the viewers of the film that we're putting out, to understand that every advancement that we've made against New York State, even gaming, came because we pushed it. The people did. They forced Iger down us because we were already doing gaming, and they wanted to wrestle control over it. We have been selling tobacco products and fuel products on our territories against the wishes of New York State. They still claim they have the right to tax our commerce. But we say, oh, hell no, you don't. They claim they do, but they can't enforce it. So we live in this, this kind of, I called it in the film, this American purgatory. We're being regarded as wards. The federal government claims to be our trustee, and that Congress has ultimate power over our lives. Nobody else has this. No other people in the world have this. Look, there are oppressed people all over the world, don't get me wrong. But this is the United States as a function of policy, as a function of law, as a function of legal doctrines. That's why I talk about this stuff. Folks, I want to thank you for listening. If you care to, I'm going to do another show tomorrow on WPFW in Washington, D.C. It'll be a little different than this one, so don't be afraid to tune in. I'm John Kane. This is Resistance Radio. I thank you for listening. As I say in my language, Nyahweh. Nyahweh.